There is a place in southwestern Libya where the rock face rises out of the sand in great gray shelves, stacked and eroded by a wind that has been working on them for longer than our species has had a name for wind. The shelter sits inside a valley called Wadi Takarkori, tucked into the Tadrartakakis Mountains near the Algerian border, and if you drove to it today, you would need a four-wheel drive vehicle and a willingness to spend hours crossing terrain that looks, in every direction, like the surface of a dead planet. Sand. Rock. The particular silence of a place that has not seen rain in a very long time. The Sahara Desert is the largest hot desert on Earth. It covers an area roughly the size of the United States. In the popular imagination, it is the definition of emptiness. A place where nothing lives, nothing grows, nothing has ever mattered very much. A vast irrelevance between the Mediterranean coast and the rest of the continent. But here is the first thing you need to understand, because everything else in this story depends on it. The Sahara has not always been the Sahara. Between approximately 14,500 and 5,000 years ago, something happened to the climate of North Africa that transformed that empty quarter into one of the most hospitable landscapes on the planet. Monsoon patterns shifted. Rain came, and it kept coming. Waters that had been dry channels for millennia began to fill. Lakes appeared where there had been nothing but hardpan. Grassland spread across what is now one of the most barren surfaces on Earth. Scientists call this period the African Humid Period. Some call it the Green Sahara. The name doesn't fully prepare you for what it actually meant. Hippopotamuses lived there. Crocodiles patrolled the lakes. Elephants moved through acacia woodland. Giraffes. Warthogs. Every large mammal that now lives in the wet savannas of East and Central Africa was living in what is now the Central Saharan Desert. Because the Central Saharan Desert was, for those thousands of years, a wet savanna. The rock art confirms it. On the walls of caves and shelters across what is now an absolute desert, people painted animals that have not lived in this region for 7,000 years. They painted cattle being milked. They painted fish. They painted swimming. People lived there too. Not just passing through. Not just seasonal visitors. People who built fires, made pottery, buried their dead, raised children, herded animals, and looked out from the shelter at Takarkori across a permanent lake. That does not exist anymore, and has not existed for 5,000 years. We know almost nothing about who those people were. That is not unusual. Prehistoric populations across Africa are among the least understood on the planet. The academic resources, the funding, the excavation priorities, most of them have pointed elsewhere. And there is a specific compounding problem with North Africa, and the Sahara in particular. When the Green Sahara ended and the desert returned, it returned completely. The conditions that made that landscape livable, the moisture, the permanent water, are the same conditions that destroy ancient DNA. Hot, humid environments eat genetic material. Bones that might preserve readable sequences in a cold Siberian cave, or a waterlogged bog become chemically inert in the heat of the Sahara. Researchers had spent decades trying to extract usable DNA from remains across North Africa and failing. So the people who lived in the Green Sahara remained a mystery defined almost entirely by what they left on the ground. Pottery, stone tools, animal bones, the paintings on the walls. A picture of behavior without a picture of biology. Archaeologists could tell you what these people ate, roughly how they moved across the landscape, what technologies they used. Nobody could tell you who they actually were, where they came from, how they fit into the larger human story, what relationship, if any, they had to the populations living around them. The assumption, in the absence of evidence, was reasonable. It seemed self-evident. The Green Sahara had been a corridor. That was the working theory for decades among researchers studying prehistoric North Africa. The logic was sound. The landscape invited movement. A hospitable belt of savanna and lakes connecting North Africa to sub-Saharan Africa. To the south and through the eastern Mediterranean, to the populations of the Near East and Europe to the north. If animals had poured in from the sub-Saharan savannas, surely the people had too. A mixing zone. A crossroads. A place where human populations from different directions met traded, blended, and moved on. That seemed like the answer. For a long time, it was the answer simply because nobody had the evidence to contradict it. Then Savino di Lernia drove a four-wheel drive vehicle across the desert to a rock shelter in southwestern Libya. And on the second day of the excavation, someone's trowel hit something. Di Lernia was leading a team from Sapienza University of Rome in a project focused on the Wadi Takakori area, beginning in 2003. The shelter had been known to researchers for years. The Tadrart Akakis region is famous for its prehistoric rock art, and sites like Takakori had been documented and visited since the mid-20th century. But systematic excavation, the kind that goes slowly through the layers and maps exactly what is where and what is touching what, had not been done. The team found what Di Lernia later described as scratching the sand and finding a mandible, a jawbone, human, just below the surface in the cool dark of the shelter. Then more. Over the seasons of fieldwork from 2003 to 2006, 15 individuals emerged from the sediment at Takakori, all of them women and children, all of them buried here across a span of more than 4,000 years, generation after generation, family after family, returning their dead to this specific place. The site was extraordinary in every direction. Pottery fragments by the hundreds, some of them carrying residues in their clay that would later be analyzed by chemists and found to contain milk fats, not just the fats of animal flesh, which you might expect from a herding community. Milk fats specifically, the kind produced by repeatedly heating dairy products, by making cheese and butter and yogurt. What the pottery fragments told researchers was that the people at Takakori were not just keeping cattle and goats. They were dairying, processing milk into storable products. And the dates put that activity in the 5th millennium before the Common Era, making Takakori the site of the oldest confirmed dairying operation in Africa. People were making cheese here, while the pyramids were still 4,000 years in the future. The rock art on the nearby cave walls showed the same story from a different angle. Cattle everywhere. Scenes of herding, hunting, human figures moving through a landscape with animals. And, in some of the paintings, explicit scenes of milking. A human figure crouching beside a cattle animal, hand extended. The oldest dairy industry on the African continent, recorded in pigment on stone. 2 of the 15 individuals were exceptional, both women. Both estimated to have been in their 40s when they died, somewhere around 5,000 years before the Common Era. Their bodies had been naturally mummified by the desiccating conditions of the desert that returned after the Green Sahara ended. The skin was still present. The ligaments, the tissues, not perfectly preserved in the way of an Egyptian royal mummy, not deliberately treated, or wrapped, but intact enough that thousands of years later, when a researcher crouched over them in the shelter, they were recognizably people. Women who had lived full lives, who had herded animals and made dairy products and watched this landscape dry and tighten around them in their final years. For years, attempts to extract DNA from these remains failed. Hot environments are the enemy of ancient genetic material. Every sample that went to a laboratory came back with nothing usable, or with contamination that made the results unreadable. The partial picture came in 2019, when researchers managed to recover mitochondrial DNA, the genetic material passed down exclusively through the maternal line, from the 2 mummified women. That was a significant advance. Mitochondrial DNA gave researchers a maternal lineage, a partial picture of ancestry. But it was like looking at one branch of a tree and trying to describe the whole forest. You could see something. You could not see enough. The samples eventually made their way to the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Leipzig, Germany, which has spent the last 2 decades developing computational methods specifically designed to pull readable genetic sequences from ancient material that seems, by any conventional standard, too degraded to yield anything. Harold Ringbauer, a researcher and group leader in archaeogenetics at the Institute, later described what they were working with plainly. There was very little DNA. What existed was fragmented, and damaged in the particular ways that hot environment preservation produces. The analysis required methods fine-tuned over years of incremental improvement, applied to material that had previously defeated every other approach. In April of 2025, the results were published in Nature, the first whole genomes ever recovered from anywhere in the Sahara Desert. And what those genomes said was not what anyone had expected. Let me walk you through what the scientists found, because the details matter, and because the details are where the story changes. The first thing they looked for was the thing everyone expected to find: evidence of the mixing that the corridor theory predicted. Sub-Saharan African ancestry flowing in from the south, Near Eastern, and European genetic signatures arriving from the north and east. The genetic fingerprint of a crossroads population, blended from multiple sources, the way populations almost always look when they have been living at the meeting point of different human worlds. It was not there. The two women from Takakori showed no significant sub-Saharan African ancestry, no Mediterranean or Near Eastern genetic signature beyond the faintest possible trace. What they showed instead was something that stopped the researchers when they first saw it. A genetic profile that belonged to no known population, ancient or modern. A lineage that had apparently separated from the ancestors of sub-Saharan African populations approximately 50,000 years ago, around the same time that the earliest modern humans were beginning to move out of Africa into the rest of the world, and had then stayed essentially unchanged for tens of thousands of years. Johannes Krause is the director of the Department of Archaeogenetics at the Max Planck Institute. He has spent his career analyzing ancient human DNA from populations across the planet. When he saw the Takakori genomes, he said this: "If you had told me these genomes were 40,000 years old, I would have believed it." Sit with that for a moment. A scientist who has seen ancient human DNA from everywhere. From Neanderthals, from the earliest modern Europeans, from populations that have been in their graves for tens of thousands of years, looked at the DNA from two women buried in a Libyan rock shelter 7,000 years ago, and said the genetic signature was so unchanged, so isolated, so untouched by the movement of the world around it, that he could have been convinced he was looking at something twice as old. The lineage was not just unknown. It was ancient in a way that defied everything the researchers thought they understood about what the Green Sahara had been doing to the human populations inside it. But it was the Neanderthal finding that added the layer nobody had anticipated. When modern humans began leaving Africa roughly 50 to 60,000 years ago, they encountered Neanderthals living in Eurasia, and they interbred with them. The result is that every person on the planet today whose ancestry comes from outside Africa carries somewhere between 1 and 4% Neanderthal DNA in their genome. It is a signature of contact, of departure, of the moment our ancestors first moved into a world that was already occupied. People whose ancestry stayed in sub-Saharan Africa throughout that period carry essentially no Neanderthal DNA because their ancestors never left Africa and never encountered Neanderthals. The Takakori women sat between these two groups in a way that no one had seen before. They carried 10 times less Neanderthal DNA than any modern European, far less than the populations of the Levant or the Mediterranean, but slightly more than contemporary sub-Saharan populations. What that tells researchers is that the ancestors of the Takakori lineage had some contact with populations that had been outside Africa, enough to absorb a faint trace of Neanderthal ancestry, but far less contact than the populations that eventually colonized the rest of the world. A population that existed at the edge of the out-of-Africa story. Present for it, but not part of it. Touched by it, but not transformed. This lineage, this North African ghost population, as some researchers have begun calling it informally, had been sitting in North Africa, largely undetected, for a very long time. The Takakori women also showed close genetic affinity with 15,000-year-old foragers who had lived at Tafaralt Cave in Morocco during the Ice Age, thousands of kilometers to the northwest and thousands of years earlier. A lineage that was already ancient and already widespread across North Africa before the Green Sahara had even begun. And here is where the story becomes genuinely strange. The pottery at Takakori came from the Nile Valley, from sub-Saharan Africa, The styles, the clay compositions, the manufacturing techniques all pointed to cultural contact across enormous distances. The herding technology that appears at the site around 8,300 years ago, the cattle, the goats, the dairying, almost certainly arrived from the Near East, where domestication had been established and was spreading westward across the ancient world. Ideas were moving across the Green Sahara in every direction. Practices were crossing it. Technologies were traveling along it. The shelter walls show cattle painted in styles shared with people thousands of kilometers away. But the genes do not move. Not a single genetic trait of any of those incoming populations appears in the Takakori women's genomes. The herders who brought livestock practices from the Near East left their animals behind, but apparently not their bodies. The communities to the south who shared pottery traditions with Takakori apparently never stayed long enough, or close enough, to leave a biological mark. The Green Sahara, the great green walkable bridge between all the human worlds of the ancient African continent, was a corridor for civilization and a wall for population. That is not how things are supposed to work. Every other place in the ancient world where new technologies arrived is accompanied by genetic evidence of the people who brought them. The spread of farming across Europe, for instance, is written clearly in the ancient DNA record as a movement of actual farming populations. Technology and people move together. That is the expectation, built from decades of evidence from every other region of the world where ancient DNA has been studied. At Takakori, the technology moved, the people did not. Somehow, a small, isolated population on the edge of the world's most forbidding desert looked at the livestock practices arriving from thousands of kilometers away, absorbed them completely, made them their own, produced the oldest dairy industry in Africa, and did all of it without a single new person joining their community. The researchers describe this as cultural diffusion, ideas crossing without bodies. But what that phrase does not capture is the strangeness of it, the specificity of what it means about these people. It means that when herders arrived from the east with their animals and their knowledge and their ways of managing livestock, the people at Takakori watched, learned, adopted, and the herders either left or remained as guests who never became family. It means that the green, welcoming, lake-dotted landscape that surrounded them for thousands of years was hospitable to every idea that came through it, and somehow resistant to the permanent arrival of anyone new. We do not know why. That is the honest answer. The genetic isolation is real and measurable, and now confirmed by the most rigorous methods available to the science. The reason for it is not in the data. Nada Salem, the first author of the Nature paper, is a PhD student at the Max Planck Institute who led the study. Her framing of what they found is careful and precise in the way that good scientists are careful and precise. The discovery reveals how pastoralism spread across the Green Sahara, likely through cultural exchange rather than large-scale migration. The Green Sahara was not a corridor for the movement of people, but for sure it was a corridor for ideas and technology. Those are the words of Savino di Lernia, who spent 3 seasons in the desert excavating this site and has spent decades since thinking about what it means. A corridor for ideas, not for people. I keep coming back to that, because what it means, stripped of the academic framing, is that the people at Takakori maintained something across thousands of years of opportunity not to. Every herder who came through from the east was an invitation to blend. Every community to the south that shared pottery traditions was a potential source of new genes, new faces, new bloodlines. And yet, the community at Takakori, small, we know, from the genetic analysis, a moderately sized group, relatively little inbreeding, held itself together in a way that left no genetic seam where the outside world had touched. That is not passivity. That is not isolation by default or by geography. The mountains of Tadrat Akakas are not the Himalayas. The valley is accessible. The people were clearly in contact with the wider world, clearly engaged with it, clearly trading in its ideas and its technologies. Their isolation is not the isolation of people who did not know the outside world existed, It is the isolation of people who knew it very well and remained themselves anyway. Now here is the part of this story that I find most difficult to hold. The lineage is gone, not diluted, not absorbed so thoroughly that it is invisible. Gone in the sense that the specific genetic profile of the Takarkori women, that ancient, isolated, 50,000-year-old North African lineage, no longer exists in the world in the form it once had. It survives as a component. Modern North Africans carry fragments of it, the way you carry fragments of a relative who died long before you were born, present in the proportion of a cheekbone, the set of an eye. The ancestry is there, scattered and mixed, embedded in the populations that eventually replaced or absorbed the people who carried it whole. But the lineage itself, as it existed in the two women at Takarkori, as it existed in the community that returned to that shelter generation after generation for 4,000 years and buried their dead in the cool dark of its stone, is functionally extinct. At some point between the end of the Green Sahara and the present, the world caught up with them. The populations that had been flowing around them for millennia without touching them finally did. The genetic wall that had held for longer than most human populations have existed anywhere on Earth eventually came down. We do not know when. We do not know how. We do not know if it happened quickly or slowly, peacefully or otherwise. We know only that it happened. And there is a second layer to the loss, one that sits outside the science and inside the specific present tense of the world. Since 2011, Libya has been in a state of sustained political instability and intermittent armed conflict that has made archaeological fieldwork in the Tadrar-Dakakis region essentially impossible. The shelter at Takarkori sits unreachable in a security environment that international researchers cannot safely enter. Dilernia has not been back. The other 12 individuals buried at the site, the ones whose DNA has not been extracted, whose genomes have not been sequenced, who might tell researchers something entirely different about the range of genetic variation within this community, or confirm what the two mummified women showed, or complicate it in ways nobody can currently predict. They are still there. In the sand. In the dark. Behind a border that science cannot currently cross. The two women whose genomes changed what researchers believed about the human history of the Sahara were found on the second day of the excavation. They were found because someone drove to the site and started digging. There may be answers in the remaining burials that would transform the story again. Answers of the same magnitude, sitting a few centimeters below the surface of a site that may not see a scientific excavation for years or decades. Nobody knows. There is something in that situation that feels like a specific kind of cruelty. Not dramatic cruelty. Quiet cruelty. The cruelty of proximity without access. Of knowing where the answers are and being unable to reach them. Pull back from all of it for a moment. From the genetics and the site and the political situation and the specific tragedy of an extinct lineage. Consider what the Takarkori story is actually telling us about how human civilization spreads. The working model for how pastoralism moved across the ancient world was, for a long time, people. A population learns to herd animals, realizes the advantages, moves outward, carries the practice with it, and the practice spreads because the people carrying it spread. That is how farming moved across Europe. That is how the genetic record of the ancient world reads in almost every region, where ancient DNA has been recovered in significant quantities. Technology and population move together because technology lives in people, and when people move, they bring it. At Takarkori, the cattle came. The goats came. The dairying techniques came. The oldest African cheese was being made here by a community that had learned the practice from somewhere else, from people, who had domesticated animals long before the people at this shelter had, and the community that made that cheese was genetically untouched by any of the people who might have taught them. What that means for the bigger picture is something researchers are still working out, but one implication is hard to escape. Human beings are capable of transmitting complex technologies across enormous distances without any movement of the populations carrying them. Not as a rare exception, as a primary mechanism. The Green Sahara was, for thousands of years, a network of knowledge and practice and material culture that ran across a continent, and the people inside it were participants, in that network without ever becoming genetically part of each other. That is a different model of how civilization moves than the one that has dominated the field. And it comes from two women in their 40s who died in a rock shelter in Libya 7,000 years ago, and whose bodies were dry enough, and the shelter cool enough, and the luck specific enough that when a researcher from Rome arrived with a trowel in 2003, there was something left to find. I want to end with what we do and do not know, because the honest version of this story requires both. We know that the people at Takakori were genetically distinct from every other population so far studied, ancient or modern. We know they belong to a lineage that split from the rest of humanity around 50,000 years ago and remained largely unchanged for tens of thousands of years after that. We know they were making dairy products before anyone else in Africa. Here is the rewritten closing. Same meaning, same rhythm, articles and redundant connectives trimmed throughout. Copy-paste ready. We know their pottery connects them to a wider world their genes do not. We know their lineage no longer exists in the form they carried it. Decades of assumptions about human history in the Sahara. We do not know their names. That someone, someday, might be able to read more deeply. Moving south toward moisture, Takakori could no longer provide. Their dead in that shelter knew it was the last. Whether they felt change as an ending, or simply as weather. Wondering what would happen to animals when the lake was gone. Who were, in the most literal genetic sense, unlike anyone alive on Earth today. A lineage already ancient when pyramids were being built. Then most of recorded human history had been running. That absorbed technologies of an ancient world while refusing to absorb its people. That eventually, finally, after all of that, was absorbed anyway. Takakori still stands, into stone by hands gone for 7,000 years. Desert has returned to everything outside it. Somewhere in sand below that shelter floor, 12 more people are waiting. We do not know yet what they will say. We do not know if we will get the chance to ask. Its own summary of this entire story. Of years when science finally came for them, they were still, unmistakably, only themselves.